How's it going, online learners? This is your 8.1 notes for civil rights and other movements. This is a good starting point for your project. Please do not just copy and paste these because you will lose points. You don't have to do quizzes. You don't have to fill in anything or answer anything. You just got to listen. So some background information before we talk about the civil rights. Way back in the beginning of the year, we talked about the Reconstruction era. The end of the Civil War brought on some good times. We have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, all good amendments towards African Americans that abolished slavery, African American citizenship, and the right to vote for men. Once Reconstruction ends in 1877, we see many of the reforms and advances that were made for African Americans. They were lost to institutionalized racism and discrimination. Some ways that African Americans were oppressed: Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, and the KKK. Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson is one of our more famous court cases. Because of this court case, separate but equal is legalized. So this means that it is legal for racial segregation in the US. Schools start to be segregated, movie theaters, restaurants, all start to be segregated, usually more in the South. So this is one of our mistakes in the Supreme Court, I guess you could say. The Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a struggle for social justice. The movement took place during the 1950s and 60s for Black Americans to gain equal rights. The Civil War had officially abolished slavery, but didn't end discrimination against Black people. By the 1950s, Black Americans had more than enough of prejudice and violence against them. They, along with many white Americans, mobilized and began an unprecedented fight for equality. Let's start with the NAACP. It was founded in 1909, a little bit before the Civil Rights Movement really started, but their whole goal was to seek change, but through the court, through the legal system. One of the famous quotes that they have: "To achieve through peace and lawful means equal citizen rights for American citizens by eliminating segregation and discrimination in housing, employment, voting, schools, the courts, transportation, and recreation." The NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This will be on your final exam. Brown v. Board of Education. This court case is super important because it overturns Plessy v. Ferguson, that Supreme Court case we just talked about segregation. It was a landmark court case in 1954 when the Supreme Court case in which the justice ruled unanimously that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional. Brown v. Board of Education helped establish the precedent that separate but equal education and other services were not, in fact, equal at all. So very important, and that's when we start seeing the Little Rock Nine, which you guys will talk about in your project. The Montgomery bus boycott. This is what many people regard as the start of the Civil Rights Movement. In 1955, Rosa Parks sat in a white-only section on an Alabama bus. She was arrested for refusing to get up. 4 days later, the first large-scale demonstration against segregation was underway, lasting for 381 days. Black Americans in Alabama conducted sit-ins and refused to take the bus until it was integrated. Martin Luther King Jr. comes down and he starts leading these sit-ins and this movement, this boycott in Montgomery. March on Washington, 1963. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Over 250,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. Just take a second and look at the amount of people there. They're all for the rights for African Americans. It is not just Black people. It is white people, Black people, all different demographics coming together seeking change. Some important legislation that Lyndon B. Johnson signs: the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, or ethnic origin in hotels, restaurants, and other places of employment connected to the government. So if the government provides any sort of services, money to any sort of hotels, restaurants, and other places, they cannot discriminate. One of the biggest things that it did, though, this new law sped up the desegregation of schools. Schools gets funding from the government. Schools now had to speed up their desegregation process. The Voting Rights Acts of 1965 ended poll taxes and prohibited literacy tests to prevent people from voting. So that is another big change as well. The civil rights movement leads to other movements. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Many historians argue that his death ended the civil rights movement. Over the next couple of decades and to the present, more legislation has passed, but inequality and racism still exist today. The civil rights movement shine a light on the social injustices that have been done to African Americans. Through the movement, we saw peaceful and violent protests, new legislation, desegregated schools, and the emergence of other civil rights movements. So that was some brief notes on the civil rights movements. You guys will research more on your project, but this is a good starting point for you. The women's rights movement. Women demanded equal rights such as equal pay, reproductive rights, less of a role in childcare, and more of a role in work. Feminism, the belief that men and women should be equally politically, socially, and economically. A big part of this movement that you guys are going to focus on is wanting equal pay for equal work in the workplace. For a long time in history, women have been paid less than men for doing the same job. So that's going to be a big part of this movement. The National Organization for Women was founded in 1966, which organized protest and provided support for feminist causes. They would protest, they would seek legislation in court cases. And some of the results that we see is the Equal Pay Act, the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court case, which guarantees abortion rights, and Title IX, which guarantees equal funding for sports for women. The Migrant Farmers Movement. The Immigration Act of 1965 allowed many immigrants to come into the U.S. from Mexico and Latin America. Farmers took advantage of immigration status, meaning they paid really, really low wage, they worked long hours, and they lived in shanties or tents, and they had to move a lot to find work. So they didn't have a whole lot of rights, and it was a very hard lifestyle. The United Farm Workers organized a group of migrant farmer workers that wanted to improve their living and working conditions, wages, housing, and education. How did they seek reform? Through boycotts, nonviolent strikes, marches, and fasting. We see three big movements: the Llano Grape Boycott, the Chiquita Banana Boycott, and the Chavez Hunger Strike. All super important. If you guys want to talk about the migrant farmers in your project, you're going to need to do some more research than that. Native Americans. Native Americans have been persecuted and discriminated against for a long time in the U.S. They had low income, high unemployment, discrimination, lack of education, and lack of land rights. The American Indian Movement, protests and legislation, occupation of Alcatraz. It was an abandoned prison. For 19 months, they claimed ownership by right of discovery. Some victories that they got: the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act increased federal funding for education on reservations and enlarged tribal government's involvement in federal programs. Native Americans begin to win land and water rights in courts. So they have a little victories, but you guys will need to do some more research further into it. The gay liberation movement. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, LGBTQ people could be in prison, committed to mental health institution, or fired from their jobs. During the Cold War, we had the Red Scare, but we also have the Lavender Scare, where LGBTQ people were labeled as subversive and anti-American and were fired from jobs in the U.S. government and military. The gay liberation movement. Police frequently would target and raid gay bars. The Stonewall riots is the most important, probably part of the gay liberation movement because it starts it. In 1969, the police raided the Stonewall Inn, a mafia-owned gay bar in New York. The mafia owned most gay bars because they were not legal. A riot of almost 600 people broke out, and the police had to barricade themselves inside for safety. A clash began between rioters and protesters as many people were arrested and injured. Results of the Stonewall brought awareness to violence and harassment of LGBTQ community, growth of LGBTQ organizations and publications, and the beginning of the gay liberation movement. That is the end of your notes. Like I said, these notes are very, very broad. It's just to get you started for your project. But that's all I got for you.